Welcome to the debate. Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of absolute precision.
Like engineering.
Exactly, like engineering. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is.
Right. It's binary. It's totally clear cut, broken or not broken.
Yeah, it's clean and frankly, it's comforting. We naturally like things to be visible and easily categorized. But then you step into the world of neurodevelopment or, generational trauma and deep psychological fragmentation, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just utterly useless. We find ourselves looking at a diagnostic landscape that is completely murky.
Oh, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. You can't just point to a shadow on a scan and say, yes, there's the trauma.
You really can't. And there is perhaps no better illustration of these muddy waters in modern storytelling than Thomas Shelby. So today we are looking specifically at the conclusion of his journey in Peaky Blinders, the Immortal Man. But we aren't just looking at the plot, right? We are examining his psychological architecture through a very specific clinical framework.
Right, the Internal Family Systems Model, or IFS.
Exactly, IFS.
And, for listeners who might be new to the IFS framework, it is just a fascinating way to look at human psychology. It basically asks you to imagine that your mind isn't just one single unified personality, but rather an internal family made up of different parts.
You have the exiles, which are usually the traumatized, vulnerable parts of yourself that carry all your pain, essentially locked in the basement.
Right, kept out of sight. Exactly. Then you have the managers, which are the hyper-rational, controlling parts of your brain that run your daily life. They try to keep those exiles safely locked away so you don't just, break down. And finally, you have the firefighters.
The extreme measures?
Right. When the pain of an exile starts to leak out, a firefighter steps in with extreme measures like impulsive violence, substance abuse, self-harm, just to numb the pain and put out the emotional fire.
It is such a brilliant way to understand complex trauma. And that brings us to the central question we are debating today. Does the conclusion of the Immortal Man represent Tommy achieving genuine, self-led psychological liberation, meaning his core, healed self finally takes the wheel, or
is his final arrangement simply the ultimate, cold-blooded calculation of his internal manager parts, orchestrating a completely artificial piece?
Right, it's a profound question.
It really is. Because on the surface, the narrative really wants us to feel a sense of resolution. The music swells, the tone shifts, but when you actually look under the hood at the mechanics of his psychology, the picture gets incredibly complicated.
Well, I'll lay my cards on the table right out of the gate. I look at Tommy's journey in his film, and I see it culminating in a successful, profound psychological liberation.
Really? Profound liberation?
Yes, absolutely. Look, for decades, his internal system has been entirely governed by extreme managers, specifically what I would call the cold strategist and the legacy protector. These parts were working overtime 24/7 to repress his exiles.
Which hold all his PTSD from the First World War.
Exactly. His PTSD, his guilt, his immense grief. And whenever those exiles threatened to break through the basement door, his firefighters immediately took over. He used extreme violence and, copious amounts of opium to numb the system. But in this film, he reaches an absolute breaking point. The loss of Polly, who essentially acted as his system's external moral auditor, forced those managers into a dictatorial overdrive. But finally, through the vision of his daughter Ruby acting as a voice of clarity, Tommy breaks the hold of these toxic parts. His final acts, sparing the fascist doctor and burning his funeral wagon, demonstrate the emergence of his core self.
Okay, but
It's characterized by calmness, compassion, and confidence. It is what IFS therapists call a classic unburdening.
I see where you're coming from, but I look at the exact same sequence of events and see a highly sophisticated illusion of healing.
An illusion?
Totally. Look, I completely agree that the IFS model perfectly maps Tommy's extreme fragmentation. It's like the framework was built for him. But I argue that a truly self-led system requires actual internal integration. You have to bring the disparate parts together and heal them.
Which I argue he does.
But he doesn't. He merely reshuffles his defense mechanisms. Look at how he fundamentally rejects his wife, Lizzie. She represented a genuine, living opportunity to heal those exiles, to experience real, grounded intimacy. But his managers viewed her empathy as a critical security flaw and just expelled her. So I look at that ending and I see that Tommy's final piece is entirely manufactured by turning his son, Duke, into a new shadow successor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a living, breathing vessel to hold his violent manager and firefighter parts. Outsourcing your pathology to the next generation is not liberation. It is the ultimate survival strategy of a rigid manager refusing to genuinely heal.
I appreciate that perspective, but let me offer a different way to look at how those internal parts are actually shifting at the end. I want to look at the battle of his visions.
Okay.
In IFS, our parts don't usually communicate with us in clear sentences, right? They communicate through imagery and bodily sensations. For years, Tommy's internal landscape was dominated by the vision of his dead wife, Grace.
Right.
Now, Grace represents what we would call an idealized exile that over time mutated into a highly toxic firefighter. Think about how she appears. She's always in the fog, in the dark, wearing that bright red dress. And what is her entire purpose?
To lure him into suicide.
Yes, to lure him into suicide. She whispers to him to just end it, promising that death is the only way to reunite with the happiness he lost.
Well, because in the context of extreme trauma, the brain sometimes views death as a safe harbor. She becomes the ultimate escape hatch for a system that is in total agony. The firefighter's job is to stop the pain, and suicide is the ultimate final way to put out the fire.
Precisely. That is exactly how a firefighter operates when the system is collapsing. But then look at the mechanics of what happens at the climax of the Immortal Man. The vision of Grace is completely supplanted by the vision of his daughter, Ruby. And the contrast is visually and psychologically intentional. Ruby doesn't appear in the dark or the fog. She appears in broad daylight next to a warm, crackling fire. And she fundamentally doesn't offer the false comfort of death. She shatters the fascist doctor's lie. She literally tells Tommy, "You are not sick. You must live."
I mean, sure, the imagery is lighter.
But it's more than just imagery. I view Ruby as an internal psychological antibody. She clears the infection of Grace's death wish out of Tommy's system. And it is only because of Ruby's intervention, because the system is finally clear of that toxic firefighter, that Tommy's true self is able to step forward and show actual compassion to the doctor who lied to him. Sparing that man's life, lowering the gun, is the definitive proof that his cold strategist manager has finally laid down its weapons.
Okay, I have to push back on that, because you are calling sparing the doctor an act of compassion led by the self. I look at that exact same scene and see the cold strategist manager operating at absolute peak efficiency.
Peak efficiency? By not pulling the trigger?
Yes. Think about why a manager operates. Its goal is to protect the system by neutralizing threats. Why does Tommy spare the doctor? Because the doctor is no longer a threat. The lie has been exposed. The social and political leverage that the doctor held is entirely gone. A calculating manager doesn't expend energy or risk exposure on violence when violence serves absolutely no strategic purpose. That isn't compassion. That's just a cost-benefit analysis. If the core self were truly leading, if Tommy were truly experiencing the IFS qualities of compassion and connection, he wouldn't have spent the entire film isolating himself in a dark, freezing room, completely cut off from his living, breathing family. You can't claim internal integration when the character is externally barricading himself from the people who actually love him.
That's a really fair challenge. The isolation at the beginning of the film is brutal to watch. But I would frame that isolation differently. It isn't a failure of the self. It is the climax of the system's crisis. We have to remember the catastrophic, systemic impact of losing Polly.
Right.
Polly wasn't just an aunt or a matriarch. In IFS terms, she was the external self-like figure for his entire internal system. She balanced the masculine energy of aggressive action with the feminine energy of intuition and nurturing. When she died, Tommy's system lost its only healthy connection to spirituality, and more importantly, its only safe space for the exiles to exist.
Yeah, it was devastating.
So the managers panicked. They went into that dictatorial lockdown you mentioned because the safety net was gone. But the burning of the funeral wagon at the end, that is the ritualistic ending of that lockdown. He is literally and metaphorically burning the external crutches that his managers relied on. He's closing that dark chapter.
You say he's ending a lockdown and burning crutches, but to me, he's just locking the door from the outside and throwing away the key.
Come on, throwing away the key?
I mean it. Because if you look at his actual behavior with real people, burning that wagon isn't just letting go of a crutch. It is a visual representation of him burning his bridges to actual healing. Let's talk about Arthur and Lizzie.
Okay, let's talk about them.
They represent the real tragedy of Tommy's system. You brought up Polly, but let's look at Arthur's role. Arthur is Tommy's exposed exile and his ultimate firefighter rolled into one tragic package.
Oh, man. Arthur.
Right? Arthur acts out all the raw, violent, weeping emotionality that Tommy absolutely refuses to feel. Arthur literally absorbs the moral stain of the violence, getting his hands dirty, so Tommy can sit in his tailored suit in his office and pretend his self is clean and aristocratic. They have a completely toxic systemic symbiosis.
I actually agree completely with that diagnosis of Arthur. It's a brilliant way to look at their dynamic. Tommy acts as the brain, the manager, setting the boundaries and the targets, and Arthur acts as the muscle, the firefighter, doing the dirty work and feeling the immediate agony of it. It's highly toxic, which is exactly why Tommy walking away and letting it all go at the end is so vital for his liberation.
But he doesn't let it go in a healthy way. He abandons it. And Lizzie is the ultimate proof that this isn't genuine healing. Lizzie is arguably the most perceptive person in Tommy's life.
She is very perceptive, yes.
As a former sex worker who navigated her way to becoming his wife, she saw right through his aristocratic, manager-driven shell. She offered him real, grounded nurturing. She actively tried to reach those traumatized exiles, the grieving father, the terrified tunneler from the war. And what did Tommy's system do in response?
It shut down.
His managers ruthlessly shut her out. They viewed her empathy not as a gift, but as a threat to the system. Think about the mechanics of it. If Tommy allowed himself to be comforted by Lizzie, his firefighter coping mechanisms would be extinguished, and his managers would lose their absolute control. He would have to be vulnerable.
Right.
So what does he do? He punishes her with silence. He forces her out of his life. How can you possibly look at a system and call it healed or self-led if its final state requires a total surgical expulsion of actual living emotional intimacy?
I have to admit, when I first watched him push Lizzie away, I was furious.
It's hard to watch.
It looks incredibly cruel on screen. I genuinely struggled to see how this could be the behavior of a healed man. But when I stepped back and looked at it through the IFS lens, my perspective shifted. I think you were demanding that a man with decades of profound, compounding trauma suddenly become capable of a normative, healthy marriage in the span of a few days.
I'm not asking for a perfect marriage. I'm just asking for...
But that's just not how unburdening works. And IFS unburdening doesn't mean you instantly become a perfect husband. It means you finally stop the active cycle of harm. And Tommy letting Lizzie leave is an act of the self.
Really?
Yes. Look at his history. In the past, his legacy protector manager would have forced her to stay, purely to maintain the public image of the intact Shelby empire. By letting her pack her bags and go, he is finally recognizing that his system is too damaged for her. He is prioritizing her well-being over his own need for control. It is an act of tragic grace.
Is it tragic grace, or is it just the manager's coldly cutting loose a liability?
Oh, that's cynical.
But it's true. A manager will absolutely jettison a relationship if it means the core system survives. And if we want to talk about how he handles the people in his life, we have to look beyond his wife. We have to look at the children. We have to look at the legacy split between Duke and Charles. This, to me, is the absolute smoking gun that Tommy hasn't achieved true IFS integration.
Interestingly, I think the division of his sons is his most profound, self-led compromise. Tommy is a realist. He recognizes that certain parts of his system, specifically the massive debts of blood and violence he has accumulated over his lifetime, are unfixable. They require management in the real world. So he leaves Duke to manage the dark legacy, to handle the underworld, But by doing that, he frees Charles. Charles is his light successor. Charles represents the exiles that have been healed, the innocent child who actually deserves a life without gunfire.
So he just splits them up.
Yes, he sends Charles away with Lizzie to a better life. That is a massive sacrifice of ego. Tommy accepts that Charles might grow up hating him. But he proves that he prioritizes breaking the generational trauma over his own selfish need to be loved as a father.
That is a very compelling argument. But I want you to really think about the mechanism of what he is actually doing to Duke in that process. You are saying he's breaking generational trauma, but I look at that dynamic and argue he is actively reproducing his fragmented IFS system in the real world, literally using his children as the raw material.
Using them?
Yes. Let's talk about how externalizing works in trauma. In IFS, when your internal system is too chaotic or too painful to manage, you start assigning those psychological roles to the people around you. You outsource the pathology. Tommy recognized the volatile Digbeth kid blood in Duke. He saw a raw, aggressive firefighter part in his own flesh and blood. And what did he do? He didn't offer to heal it. He didn't get him out of the life. He deliberately molded Duke into a new manager. He trained him to be cold, to handle the family's blood debts, to be the weapon.
Because the world they live in requires a weapon. I mean, the fascists and the rival gangs weren't going to just evaporate because Tommy had a psychological breakthrough.
But psychologically speaking, splitting your children into rigid polarized functions, one as the dark weapon, one as the idealized innocent, is the exact opposite of IFS integration. Integration is about bringing the dark and the light parts of oneself to the table, holding the contradictions, and leading them with the self.
Right, but
Tommy fundamentally can't do that. He externalizes the split because he can't hold it internally. He makes Duke hold the shadow, the violence, the managers, and the firefighters. He makes Charles hold the light, the self, in the healed exiles. He physically separates his sons because his internal system is incapable of reconciling those two halves of his own identity. That isn't a self-led liberation. That is the cold strategist realizing the machine is broken, abandoning it, and forcing his sons to carry the pieces for him.
I see the tragedy in Duke's path, I truly do. It is heartbreaking to watch a son handed a gun instead of a future. But we have to evaluate Tommy based on the starting point of his specific pathology. For his entire adult life, Tommy Shelby believed down to his marrow that anything he loved would be destroyed by his own internal darkness.
True.
His managers operated on the core, unshakable belief that isolation and ruthless control were the absolute only ways to survive. When he steps into that wagon at the end and he looks at the photos of Polly, of Ruby, of his violent past, and he sets it on fire, he is performing a literal unburdening. Think about the symbolism.
The burning wagon.
Right. The flames are replacing the destructive, chaotic fires of his past with a deliberate fire finality. And then he walks away. He walks away without the Shelby name, without the wealth, without the violent power. The manager parts, by definition, are defined by their desperate need to control external metrics of power. A manager does not walk away into the woods with nothing. Only the core self can do that, because only the self possesses the calm and the confidence to simply exist without the armor.
But you're missing the sequence of events. He only walks away after he has ensured that the armor is still being worn by Duke.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah. He only steps back into the woods when he knows the machine of the Shelby family is securely managed by his proxy. It's exactly like a ruthless corporate CEO retiring to a peaceful monastery, but only after appointing a cutthroat successor to keep the corporation's monopolies intact.
That's a harsh comparison.
But it fits. You mentioned the fire of finality in the vision of Ruby. Let's go back to that for a second. You called her a psychological antibody, but in IFS, sometimes an individual will try to resolve their pain through someone else. Tommy uses the vision of Ruby to absolve himself of the guilt over the gypsy curse. He uses Duke to carry the violence so he doesn't have to get his hands dirty anymore. He uses Charles to carry the innocence he lost in the tunnels of France.
So you think nothing really changed internally?
His internal landscape might feel quiet at the end. I'll grant you that. But it's only quiet because he has evicted all the noisy, painful parts and forced the people around him to house them.
I hear that. But I think that interpretation robs Tommy of the genuine internal paradigm shift we witness in those final moments. Think about the gun. When he holds the gun to the fascist doctor's head, the old Tommy, the Tommy completely blended with his firefighter parts, would have pulled the trigger without a second thought.
Well, sure.
The blood would have splattered, the threat would be neutralized, and he would have felt that familiar, hollow rush of vengeance. The fact that he lowers the gun, smiles, and says, "Let the peace remain," is a monumental shift in his architecture. He is no longer fighting the war. The title Immortal Man at the end doesn't mean a man who cannot be killed in physical battle. It means a man whose core self has finally achieved a state of peace that the trauma can no longer touch or manipulate.
Let the peace remain. It is undeniably a beautiful line and, beautifully delivered. But a peace that is built on the emotional exile of your deeply loving wife and the deliberate weaponization of your oldest son is an incredibly fragile artificial peace. The trauma hasn't been resolved. It has merely been relocated to a new address.
We have definitely covered some immense psychological territory today. To summarize my position, I look at the mechanics of this story and maintain that Thomas Shelby's journey in The Immortal Man is a profound, albeit gritty depiction of psychological unburdening. By letting go of his toxic defense mechanisms, breaking the hold of the idealized and dangerous memory of Grace through the clarity of Ruby, and making the ultimate ego sacrifice to protect Charles, Tommy transitions from a deeply fragmented, traumatized state to genuine self-leadership.
And to summarize my stance, while the IFS framework beautifully and perfectly illuminates the mechanics of his mind, the ending we get is a tragedy dressed up as a triumph. Tommy's psychological dictatorship didn't end, it simply evolved. He rejected the genuine healing that Lizzie offered because vulnerability was too threatening to his managers, and he cast his son Duke to carry the heavy burden of his violence so he could artificially claim a quiet peace for himself.
But despite our fundamental disagreement on what that final piece actually means, there is a lot we converge on. We both agree that the loss of Polly was the catastrophic catalyst that unbalanced his entire system, stripping away his only connection to spirituality and healthy, balancing nurturing.
Absolutely. Her absence is the black hole the entire film orbits around. And we both agree that the IFS framework perfectly maps the tragic, symbiotic relationship between Tommy and Arthur, the calculating manager and the bleeding firefighter locked in a cycle of mutual destruction. Using clinical frameworks to look at how generational trauma operates in storytelling reveals so much more than just viewing these characters through the lens of standard gangster tropes. It makes them profoundly human.
It really does. There's definitely much more to explore regarding how the Shelby legacy will continue to manifest these psychological burdens in the next generation. But we will have to leave it to the listeners to decide. When you look at that final shot of Thomas Shelby riding away on the white horse, are you looking at a clear, bright picture of a genuinely healed man?
Or, to go back to our medical analogy, are you staring at an X-ray where the fractures haven't healed at all, but have simply been pushed deeper into the murky shadows, completely out of sight?
That is a question that lingers long after the wagon fire burns out.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us.